Okay. Actually, this follows nicely after what Tillier was talking about. Didn't plan it this way, it just seemed to happen. Okay, before, to set the stage for what I'm about to say, I'd just like to make a few comments. First of all, as you probably all know, the theory of positive disintegration is, I can never get this name right, Dabrowski's theory of personality. It's not a theory of giftedness. It's a theory, and I see it as a theory in line with the grand theories of personality, such as Freud's, when people try to explain the full range of human functioning. And so I see this theory as trying to explain everything from psychopathy right through to exemplars of humanity. So it's a really ambitious attempt to explain this full range. The other thing that I learned about this theory, when compared to other, what I call grand theories of personality, is that it is unique. It's unique in many ways. One of the ways that it's unique is, at the obvious level, is just the language that it uses. It uses common, ordinary psychological terms in an idiosyncratic way. In a way that's more difficult when you're reading the original. Had he chosen to create words, like Harry Stack Sullivan created his own language to communicate his theory, so he had to learn his language. But in my reading of this theory, I keep having to shake my head because when I come across words like development or personality, as a psychologist, I have a certain association to those words, such as everyone develops, but not in this theory. Everyone has a personality, but not in this theory. In mainstream psychology, personality is taken for granted, it's a given. In this theory, personality is a rare achievement. And so as I've studied, because since I don't speak Polish, and I don't read Polish, I've only had the English books available to me, thanks to my friend Tillier, and the generosity of the Dabrowski's family that allowed the dissemination of the information. And so it's a challenge. Its uniqueness creates a challenge to any serious student of the theory. But the other, and perhaps more substantive reason why it's unique, is that it provides mechanisms by which certain phenomena occur. It explains how personality develops. It doesn't simply describe it. It doesn't simply talk about the structure of it, but it actually explains how that happens. But ultimately, as I say here, as a student of the theory, you find that it reframes all common psychological terminology. So not only is it idiosyncratic use of terms, such as adjustment, but it really genuinely calls upon us to reconceptualize what we have taken for granted in these psychological concepts. And so my journey with TPD, it's not a very auspicious, many people like Tillier, Linda, others who've encountered the theory, when they first encountered it, it really, and I think one or two people here that have may have had a similar experience to these individuals. When you first encounter it, it seems like, oh wow, this is This explains my life, you know, this resonates with me. This saved my life. I'm not making this up, I'm quoting. That's not the way it struck me. Like many other people, virtually all, I'd say everybody in, well, not everybody, virtually all the people that know about the theory in North America were introduced by that now well-known, often probably one of the most cited, next to Marland, probably one of the most cited book, the Calangela and Safran book, in which Michael Dabrowski's first introduced the theory to the field of gifted education. And so, because my interest is counseling gifted individuals, I'm not, unlike some people in the field of gifted education, my degree is not in gifted education. I'm just your regular mainstream counseling clinical psychologist who happened to fall into the theory, who happened to have referrals as a result of a small private practice began because I was hired to teach a master's practicum in counseling psychology. I fell into the theory. People kept referring people to me who were gifted. So of course, what do we do as academics? We go to the literature. And so that's how I encountered TPD. It was not a pleasant experience. As I said yesterday, I felt like throwing the book across the room because it made no sense to me. It was gibberish. It was all this, why are you bothering me with this? Why are you requiring me to learn new language, these weird sounding, overexcitability? What is this? And so for quite a while, I just avoided the theory, but if you're in counseling the gifted, and if you're into the literature, ultimately you're compelled to look at the theory, what was available through the field of gifted education. And then one thing led to another, and as I got into reading the original sources through the influence of my now best friend, Tillier, then somehow, as I struggled with it, and as I said yesterday, Dr. Michael Pirate and I collaborated. Now, Michael Pirate was a really good friend of mine, collaborator, 19 years work. Unfortunately, he passed away far too young. But as we collaborated on the theory, and we tried to read the original, as I'll repeat what I said yesterday, that he and I thought it was similar to our attempts to read Piaget in the original. And one day we said, pissed off at Piaget. Can't he just say it? Can't he just speak it? Well, actually, he's French, Swiss, so can't say can't he speak English. So I had a similar reaction to this. Then the next phase of my journey was to really take issue with the way that, as I became more and more knowledgeable from the original sources, I began to take issue with the way it was presented in the field of gifted education. So I've written a couple of pieces here and there, questioning, looking at the theory and contrasting the way research has been done and so on. I'm not going to go into detail, it's all in an article that I think Frank Fox seems to like now. So that was a phase, and I'm trying to break out of that phase. And so I'm trying to, in this phase of my journey with the theory, is to really start working on what I'm fond to say, the theory requires that we reframe psychological concepts. So I began with the notion of intelligence, and that should be coming out soon in publication. And now my next challenge is to look at self-concept. And without further ado, I guess I'm just going to have to try. Oh, and I did call this, it's a work in progress. So I'm just struggling with it. I suppose it could have dual meanings, because the autonomous self is a work in progress itself. When probably the most popular theory of self-concept is the reflected appraisals approach to the concept of self. And it's really, this to me can sum up the crux of the reflected appraisals approach. And it's, well, first of all, sorry, a little definition of it. Self-concept is very difficult to define. So it's really, in a sense, we know what self-concept is. But when it comes to doing research, it's very difficult to operationally define self-concept. But basically, it's really the totality of one's thoughts and feelings with reference to oneself. That's the long and the short of the general consensus on self-concept. I was getting ahead of myself here. So, you may not know it, but your view of self-concept is likely the reflected appraisals perspective on self-concept, and this goes back to the early part of last century. In fact, Cooley began in 1902 or something, the looking glass self, and then people like Mead and so on kind of worked with those ideas. And to me, this sums up my understanding of the reflected appraisals approach, that self-concept emerges and develops as a result of the individual's internalizing of feedback from significant others. So the self-concept is not present at birth, according to this theory, and it emerges as a result of essentially the socialization process. So when we're raising a child, and there's plenty of opportunity for us to give feedback on to the child, say, because socialization means everything that we do as parents to prepare that child to live in a particular society. So in a sense, the parents are agents of socialization, transmitting the social norms, the customs, all the food etiquette, use a spoon, don't use your hands, please pass the butter, whatever that happens in our particular society, toilet training. So there's plenty of opportunities for feedback from parents to child. And that's the grist, the initial grist for the self-concept myth. And of course, significant others tend to be identified as parents, teachers. So when you're teaching math, you're not just teaching math, you're giving out messages, what's appropriate, what's socially appropriate, what your expectations are of the child's behavior or the adolescent's behavior in your class. So through that kind of feedback, the reflected appraisals approach says the individual crystallizes the concept of self. And this concept of self is so much part of us that we don't realize, we feel as if we were born with that view of self. But in fact, it is a social construction. Now, significant others could include anybody, not just parents, teachers, and peers, but it can be a single episode where you meet somebody by chance, and he or she gives you feedback. So as we go through the developmental stage, the cognitive developmental stages, we may select the significant others. But I believe that the core of self-concept that is there throughout life, unless you undergo years of therapy, that core of self-concept begins in the preschool years. Parents, as you and I would agree, are the most significant influences in our life, for better or for worse. And even as adults, if your mother or father looks at you the wrong way, you may have an anxiety reaction. Even once they passed away, they are still influencing us. And similarly with teachers. Teachers are a very important influencer. So if a teacher says, you're no good in math, that's going to register. So, the implications of the reflected appraisals approach is that it's both a product and producer of experience. So it is produced through experience with the social environment. Then it becomes a lens through which I see the world and see myself. It's an historical artifact. According to this point of view, your self-concept, how you view yourself, and how I view myself, is really the result of years of feedback that we receive from others. So it's an historical artifact in that sense. And also, according to this approach, once it's formed, self-concept is highly resistant to change. And some of you parents may have experienced children who were told for some reason or other that they weren't so good in math or whatever, and that years later, that concept of self still persists. Or you may have been told, I'm sure we went around the room, we don't have time, but we hardly know each other. But if we went around, I'm sure you could recall interactions that you've had with parents when you were very young. And also, similarly with teachers, you could recall teachers said so-and-so about you, whether it was good or bad. If it were good, it bolstered your concept of self, and it encouraged you to pursue, say, further education, for example. It could work either way. So I won't ask you to reveal, to engage in self-disclosure, but I do recall a 40-something person crying in my office, recalling, because we're talking about his history, recalling an event, I don't recall what it was, that happened between him and his father when he was about 5 years old. And so once it's formed, it's highly resistant and difficult to change. Now, from the reflected appraisals point of view, it makes sense to think that the real way that it can be changed is by new feedback. So if it's created by social interaction and feedback, if one wants to change self-concept, it's not about having a warm bath with candles, it's about getting new feedback about self, which is a risk-taking operation, putting yourself out there to new people and encouraging feedback and paying attention to the feedback that you're getting. Now, as a young person, you really can't do that as a child. As an adult, one can have the opportunity to say, this person is giving me nothing but negative feedback, life is too short, I'll go somewhere else where I can get different feedback. And so those are some of the implications that I see in the reflected appraisals approach. Now, virtually everybody in North America, perhaps all over the world, well, certainly in North America, parents and teachers and psychologists are concerned about the valence of self-concept, whether it's positive or negative. We want positive self-concept. And so, how many times do teachers or parents seek professional help? Why? Because their child has low self-esteem. I ask parents, what would you like us to achieve in counseling? And some will say, I want them to be happy. Others will say, he's got poor self-esteem, I want to enhance that self-esteem. I don't tell them you're the cause of the low self-esteem. That's after many weeks of developing that trusting relationship. So enhancement of poor or low self-concept is a major preoccupation of educators. And like I was saying, the only remedy that, from a reflected appraisals approach, is new feedback. Now, if you say this to parents or teachers, they may misunderstand and say, well, if you just give them once or twice some positive feedback, that should register. But going back to the idea that self-concept is highly resistant to change, one has to do that repeatedly over time and not getting impatient when there is no results. So that's the kind of the gospel as I see it, according to the reflected appraisals approach to self-concept. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reframe this from a Dabrowskian point of view. So if you bear with me, we'll see to what extent I'm on the right path. So if you're looking at it from a Dabrowskian perspective, self-concept is a social construction. That's reminiscent of the influence of the second factor. Or as Tiller was talking about, conformity. And that's, if you look at it from that point of view, really the self-concept, one of the critical elements and one of the critical mechanisms of it is approval. Children are desperate for our approval. And so how do we get approval? We get approval through conforming. Mother says do X, and you do it. You may do it with an attitude, but you do it, and you get some feedback. That is approval. Same thing with teachers. Same thing with academic achievement. I kind of freaked out a couple of years ago, some of my student teachers by saying, you know, academic achievement is a function of approval and conformity. And they're saying, what? You want us to create robots? Until the light went on and said, well, when we give out an assignment to the class, don't we say, here's our expectations? And don't we mark on the basis to the extent to which students conform to that expectation? So, okay, yeah. So it's conforming. So this is clearly, when you're looking at the self-concept as most of us think about it in the psychological world, it's really a manifestation of the influence of the second factor. And as we know, the theory says, if you are living you're living your life according to the first, which is the biological factor, where people are just trying to meet their drives and instincts in a socially approved way, some people. If you're living that, being influenced by biology, and if you're also living by being influenced by the mandates of the social environment, that does not equal development. And so resistant to change makes me think of the rigid structure, mental structure that's associated with level 1 or primary integration. And again, this is adevelopmental, according to the theory. And a positive self-concept cannot be the goal of TBC. Not when you talk about crises as an important critical element of attaining the higher levels. You can't have existential anxiety and have a positive self-concept. It just contradictory. So positive self-concept in the mainstream, that's the goal. We want everybody to think highly of themselves. So we don't want them to have low self-esteem. Whereas the goal in the theory of positive disintegration is rather different. So essentially, what is called for is a transformation of self-concept into an autonomous self. And this is where I see the development coming in. And so positive disintegration is development. It's not just the process of development, it is the experience of development. Now, as I was introducing Taylor earlier, I was saying that not all disintegrations are positive. And this is the kind of thing that I believe keeps the theory of positive disintegration out of the mainstream of psychology. Because, you know, the general purpose of psychology includes being able to predict behavior. You know, what's that great saying? The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. That's mainstream psychology. With this theory, as I understand it, you cannot predict whether the disintegration will be positive or negative beforehand. You just cannot do that. As you were saying yourself, could have gone either way. And so you cannot predict this. And I see positive disintegration as a dual process of disintegration and reintegration at a higher level. So what makes it positive is that reintegration. If it were negative, you'd be thinking suicide, or may actually commit suicide, or you'd be gone down that deep well of psychosis. Whereas the positive, the reintegration side puts you at a higher level of functioning. And of course, Dabrowski defined all kinds of partial disintegration, global, and so on, but I won't get into that. So essentially, the first phase, which is the disintegration, first phase of positive disintegration, is really the destruction of primitive mental structures, this rigidly held view about self and the world. And this is accomplished by the disintegrating dynamism. The replacement or the reintegration at a higher level is brought about by the sparking of developmental dynamisms. And so, see, in my reading of the theory, I see no mention of self-concept in the theory, probably with good reason. I have seen many references to self, often hyphenated, like self-awareness, self-control. But interestingly, when he introduces his view of personality, I think it was in the 1967 book, which is Personality Shaping Through Positive Disintegration. In the chapter at the very beginning where he is introducing his ideas of personality, he spends a little bit of time distinguishing it from other terms, such as self and, don't tell me, individuality. The self, he has ego in parentheses. So, to my mind, he's equating self and ego. But then he goes on to say, basically paraphrasing in my cynical way, I'm not that interested in self, the concept, because it's got a multiplicity of definitions and it's vaguely defined. So forget getting into the word self. Individuality says yes, individuality. Everybody, as mainstream psychology would say about personality, he says, yes, everybody is an individual, distinct from others. But he really doesn't put too much stock in the word self. But the whole theory is really about self. It's really ironic in a way because it just runs through the developmental processes. And so here I see, when I look at this, these dynamisms, like feelings of shame and feelings of guilt, these are the process by which that self-concept is destroyed. You're basically, in a way, the way I interpret this, it says, hey, the way I have viewed myself doesn't make sense anymore. But we should go one step further and say, the way I viewed myself wasn't really me. That's what other people said I was. That's what other people say I am. And so these dynamisms, and I particularly like inferiority toward oneself, as opposed to Adler's view of inferiority, where it's a social comparison ideal, where you compare yourself to others, and you say, well, I feel inferior to Laurie because he's so knowledgeable about art and music. This is very different. This is like, I'm not living up to what I should be doing. I feel inferior to my own standards. And I see these as, first of all, I see them as emotions. Well, you see it right in the words. These are emotions. So the disintegrating dynamisms are negative emotions directed towards self. And those are the ways which I can see the self-concept being destroyed. And this, he places a great deal of stock in this dissatisfaction with self. That is really a very important dynamism at this stage of development. And of course the inner conflict, that higher and lower, the way the world ought to be versus the way it is, but also the way I ought to be versus the way I am, is part of that inner conflict. And so these mechanisms, he didn't like the word mechanism, that's why he used the word dynamism, but it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, as far as I'm concerned. These mechanisms can create such crises and such anxiety and depression that they serve to motivate us to resolve it. And we resolve it by, I believe, creating a hierarchy of values. Now these are now our values. We've created them. We have come to a realization that the values that I had prior to this just didn't work. They don't work. They create, I'm feeling kind of guilty if I proceed because I see a hand.
Just a quick question. So this can apply to maybe an adult, but let's say for a younger child, maybe they're not ready to move to a different level when this happens.
Well, that's a question that arose earlier, in the earlier session. Actually, in my reading of the theory, he believes, he has written, that you could see elements of this in some children as young as 1 or 2 years of age. Because what I'm not talking about here is the developmental potential, which again is a controversial thing. I mean, we rarely, certainly in North America, we rarely read any theorizing that has to do with biological basis. But developmental potential is hereditary, is a hereditary feature of the central nervous system. And so he's saying that you could see, I forget whether he uses the word nucleus, you could see the seeds of multi-levelness, you could see the seeds of these dynamisms as young as, in very young children. But again, from my point of view, that would be very, very rare. But again, if you look at the broader picture, this is not a stage theory. It's not like Piaget was, 0 to 2 is sensory motor, and then 2 to 4 is whatever. There are no ages. The only reference that I saw to ages in my reading of these books is that disintegration may be sparked by puberty or may be sparked by menopause. So there are no ages related to this, and this can be seen as early as, and I think some of the examples Linda, you were talking about earlier, you could see elements of these processes. And so, as a result of the disintegration process, the disintegrating dynamisms, in some, though not all, because this is not a universally applicable theory of development, for some individuals with the right amount of developmental potential, whatever that happens to be, I can't specify that, then the person gets propelled into the higher levels of development. And these dynamisms, developmental dynamisms, as he calls them, now serve to create the autonomous self. So you see the self-awareness, self-control, autonomy, being authentic, subject-object in oneself, and of course, education of oneself and auto-psychotherapy, which would put Linda and me out of business if everybody happened to be into auto-psychotherapy, and the third factor. So from my vantage point in trying to redefine or reconceptualize self and self-concept, I see these dynamisms as really representing the development of the autonomous self. I know who I am, I know what my values are, and now I have divested myself of what people said I was. Now, some of that may be an overlap. I may, in fact, espouse some of what I was told I was, but it's an intentionality that's different here. I've gone through the process, and now I am defining myself. And the interesting point here is that this doesn't mean that it leads to a person being perfect. Oftentimes, when people talk about exemplars, it's as if they're giving not only Mother Teresa, but they're giving God as an exemplar. If you believe that Jesus is God, Jesus is not a good exemplar to use here, because we're not talking about being perfect. Here we're talking about education of oneself. Auto-psychotherapy. I identify some source of stress. I become aware of it, and I deal with it. That's what it means. Doesn't mean that it's anxiety-free to me, or stress-free. And as I think you were pointing out when we first started, Tillier, that this may lead to more external conflict because you're doing what you believe is right. And you are, as the multi-level, organized multi-level and beyond, says that you're taking control of your life. You're taking control of your own development. And there's the self as agent, no longer a self-concept as defined by the reflected appraisals, but the self as agent that takes over and controls one's life. I think basically we've gone from other-directedness, people telling me who I am, to now self-directed. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And we have no time for questions.
I had this huge aha while you were talking. I want to see if it's right. Is it possible that it's through the hard work, motivation, getting rewards, getting the approval, that you reach the kind of achievement that is so valued in gifted education? Is that achievement motivation a unilevel goal? And is it possible, if that's true, that the reason those people who are more achievement-oriented just wash their hands of this Dabrowski nonsense and the overexcitabilities is that it's a multi-level, individual, non-conforming, non-predictable world that they don't even want to go there and can't see the value of?
Well, I think you kind of answered in a way that question through your mentioning of one-sided development. But I think it's, I guess for me, I see one similarity, maybe there are more, between this theory and Piaget's theory, other than what I said originally. And that is, the rationale for the behavior is always key. So why am I achieving? Am I achieving because it's expected of me? Am I in grade 10 and I'm expected to achieve at a high level? Or have I gone through this process of saying, yeah, this makes sense to me and I will do it? So I think the rationale, like for example, I might give $100 to the United Way because the faculty expects me to, so I'll just do it. Well, that's very different than going through a process of saying, I know why it's important to give. It's that intentionality which, to me, changes everything. And you mentioned that earlier today too, that this whole movement toward, once again, because it's a resurrection movement, towards talent development in the field of gifted education. And you and I are on the same page. I'm into the psychology of giftedness, the experience of it, it's not about production. It may be, but you can't confine it to that.
But is production conformity?
Well, it again, it may.
It depends on the reason.
It depends on the reason.
Can I interject something here? Let's look at this from a uni-level, multi-level perspective. If a uni-level person says, I want to achieve the gold star because I want to be famous, I want people to look up to me, I want status, I want to be important, then that's a uni-level. If that person says, I want to achieve that gold star because I see that as the pathway for me to contribute something meaningful to society, or to cure cancer, or to whatever, then that's a whole different picture. That's a multi-level phenomenon. And in those two motivations, you can see the higher and the lower. Simple as that.
And of course, my reference to Piaget is that Piaget wasn't interested in the child's getting the right answer, but was interested in what was the process by which the child achieved the answer, right or wrong. Yes?
Does the empathy come from the parents? We talked about spiritual earlier. Does it come through the child to the parent and then either, because we've talked about grades not being a reflection of the intelligence, that they're thinking at a different level when they're applying, what they're thinking, so they don't look at the grades or they don't look at the achievement. But is the empathy more important to them, or the realization of that more important? Does it come from the parent is my
Well,
question.
if it comes, I guess, to be a purist, if it comes from the parent, then that's socialization, and that's the product of learning. So if it strictly comes from the parents, then we're not talking about development. Because, the parents may influence in some way, but the theory really talks about developmental potential being the core of where this springs from. And at the extremes, if you have sufficient developmental potential or insufficient, it doesn't matter what the parents do or what the social environment does. It's only in the middle level that the social environment does influence.
So,
Time for one more?
so externally, could someone influence another person to have the destruction of their self-concept so that they have the opportunity to grow? Or does it actually have to happen on their own initiative?
Could you elaborate on that? Like how would...
So for example, if maybe you would present to someone else, hey, this is who you are, give them a mirror, and then, it's almost like now they see, oh, this is
I think
where
that
my
happens all
problem
the
is.
time.
Now, what do...
My wife left me and took it off. I think that happens all the time. Your actions influence other people. And if you have an intimate relationship and that other person is a significant other, then their behavior can certainly stimulate that in you. Let me reflect one more thing for 30 seconds. It's also important to understand when you have achievement, how is that achievement rewarded? Is it rewarded intrinsically or extrinsically? For example, I've achieved a gold star. The teacher says, attaboy, good boy, good job. Or does the teacher say to me, okay, Bill, that reflects a lot of hard work you put into your task. It's more intrinsic. Sometimes I think we get away and we say, attaboy, that's a good job. You're rewarding the accomplishment, not the person, not the individual. You're not rewarding the effort, you're rewarding the result. And I think we get in trouble when we do that.
I'd just like to say thanks to Sal. And over the 15 years or so that I've known Sal, I think one of the things I've most come to appreciate about him is his ability to take complexity and to make it clear and concise and easily understood. And today is just another example of that. And so I thank him very much for Just so you know, lunch is just sort of getting into the space, so if you go right away expecting to grab a snack, it may take another 5 minutes, so you've got enough time to fix it before lunch is ready.